Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at the book, Henry Ford, his life, his work, his genius.
It's really an in-depth look at Henry Ford, yeah.
It is, and I think, we hear the name Henry Ford, we think of, the Model T, we think of the assembly line,
Mass production.
mass production, but there's so much more to his story, I think, starting from the very beginning in
Yeah,
his upbringing.
exactly. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this book. It doesn't just focus on, the kind of, I guess, the stereotypical things that we know about Ford. It really delves into, his early life,
It does, his influences.
his influences.
What
Yeah.
made him the man he became. And, he starts off, he's born in 1863, rural Michigan, grows up on a farm. And you can already see, I think, even in those early years, how that environment really shaped his worldview.
Well, absolutely. And, his father, William, I mean, he kind of instilled in him this very, very strong sense of practicality and a love for, tinkering and machinery.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that story about him as a boy, like setting up a little workshop in his bedroom and just taking apart clocks and watches, just fascinated by how things worked.
Classic, classic. I mean, it's like the quintessential inventor story, right?
It is. And then there's that story about the lost watch hand. I don't know if you remember that,
Oh, yes.
where he refuses to let his father plow this one particular field for years, hoping that missing piece would turn up. I mean,
Yeah.
talk about,
Determination, persistence.
persistence. And
Yeah.
that, I think, really foreshadows the kind of focus and determination that he would later apply to the auto industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see those early glimmers of, his character.
Absolutely. But it's not just his father, right? I mean, we see the influence of his mother.
Mhm.
Sadly, she passes away when he's quite young, but then you have Clara, his wife.
Oh, Clara, she's a pivotal figure. Often overlooked, but, incredibly supportive of his ambitions and even convinces him to move to Detroit for better opportunities.
Right.
She really saw his potential, even when others doubted him.
She did, and that's something that I think we see throughout his life, this kind of going against the grain a little bit. Even early on in his career, he's working at the Edison Illuminating Company as an engineer, and he's got this fascination with the internal combustion engine.
Which at the time was not the popular choice.
Not at all.
Many of his colleagues were all about electric cars.
Right. They saw gasoline as messy and unreliable.
Exactly. But Ford had this intuition, this vision that gasoline was the future.
He did, and it's
Cool.
interesting because you think about him working for Edison, such a pioneer in so many ways, and yet here's Ford, kind of going in a different direction.
It shows you that even the greatest minds can disagree.
It can. But what's interesting to me is like what makes someone like Ford leave the security of a steady job, working for Edison to pursue this dream, this vision that many people thought was crazy.
I think it was a combination of his unwavering belief in himself and his vision and just the sheer passion, this drive to create something new, something better.
He had that entrepreneurial spirit, right?
Absolutely. He was convinced that he could build a car that was lighter, more affordable, more accessible to the average person.
And so that leads him to his first car, the quadricycle.
Yeah.
Right. Built in a backyard workshop. I mean, it's such a classic.
Oh, the backyard workshop. I mean, iconic image, right?
Yeah. And who could forget that story of him having to break down the wall of that workshop just to get the finished quadricycle out onto the street?
It speaks volumes about his unconventional thinking, his willingness to literally break down barriers to achieve his goals.
And, he sells that first car for a mere $200.
$200, can you imagine?
Can you imagine? And that's just the start, right? That's the very beginning.
It's the spark that ignites an incredible journey.
And that journey, I think, really kicks into high gear with the founding of the Ford Motor Company in 1903.
Right. He partners with Alexander Malcolmson, a coal dealer, and they embark on this mission to bring Ford's vision of affordable cars to life.
And it's not easy, right? I mean, they face so many challenges, securing investors.
Convincing people to believe in this radical idea.
It was a radical idea at the time. And even once they get the company going, there's still that constant struggle to refine the designs, to improve the manufacturing process.
And that's where his mechanical genius really comes into play.
It does. He's not just a businessman. He's an engineer at heart.
Yeah, he's obsessed with every detail, every component.
He's constantly tinkering, trying to figure out how to make things better, more efficient.
And that drive for efficiency, that's going to lead him to one of his most groundbreaking innovations, the moving assembly line.
Right, and that's where we'll pick up next time. But before we go, I want to just emphasize, we've talked about his upbringing, his early career, but even in these early years, you can see those themes that are going to run throughout his life.
Hmm.
That persistence, that drive to innovate, that willingness to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And those themes are going to play out in even bigger ways as we move into the story of the Model T and beyond.
So join us next time as we delve into the creation of the iconic Model T, the revolution of the assembly line, and the impact that Henry Ford had, not just on the automobile industry, but on American society as a whole.
It's going to be a fascinating ride.
It is, so buckle up and we'll see you next time.
Uh-huh.
We left off last time talking about the assembly line, and really, that was a game changer, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It revolutionized manufacturing. I mean, think about it. Before the assembly line, cars were built one at a time. Skilled craftsmen working on each individual vehicle.
It was like making a bespoke suit, you know, each
Yeah.
one unique.
Exactly. And that meant cars were expensive. Only the wealthy could afford them. But Ford had this vision, of making cars for the masses.
And the assembly line was the key to that, right? I mean,
Right.
suddenly you could churn out cars at an unprecedented rate.
It was all about efficiency, breaking down the process into these simple, repetitive tasks. Anyone could do it.
It really changed the face of manufacturing, and not just for cars.
Yeah.
I mean, other industries started adopting the assembly line model.
Oh, yeah. It had a ripple effect across the board. But of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were downsides to this kind of mass production.
When you're talking about worker alienation, right? I mean, those repetitive tasks could become incredibly monotonous.
Exactly. And, there were concerns about the impact on craftsmanship. That sense of pride in building something from start to finish.
And then there's that whole sociological department thing, right? Where Ford tried to control workers' lives, even outside the factory.
Yeah, that's a bit of a controversial chapter. He had this idea of promoting wholesome living, encouraging thrift home ownership, traditional family values,
I mean, on the one hand, he's paying them a good wage, right? The famous $5 a day.
which was unheard of at the time.
But then he's got these investigators going into their homes, making sure they're living up to his standards.
It does seem a bit intrusive, right? I mean, where do you draw the line between, caring for your employees and controlling their lives?
It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
And it definitely sparked some pushback. Workers started organizing, demanding better working conditions and the right to unionize.
Which Ford was vehemently opposed to.
He saw unions as a threat to his authority.
Yeah.
He wanted to be in control of his own company.
It led to some pretty contentious battles, strikes, clashes with union organizers.
But it's interesting how even with all this going on, Ford is still innovating, still pushing the boundaries of his business. He buys the Detroit-Toledo and Ironton Railroad in 1921.
Oh, yeah. He was all about vertical integration, right? Controlling every aspect of the process from raw materials to transportation.
He even acquired coal mines, timberlands. He had his own fleet of Great Lakes freighters.
It's like he was building his own little empire.
He was. He wanted to make sure everything ran smoothly and efficiently, all feeding into that giant machine that was the Rouge plant.
Talk about a
Unbreakable.
control freak, right?
Well, maybe not in a negative sense, but definitely someone who wanted things done his way.
But that desire for control, it didn't always manifest in positive ways. We have to talk about the Dearborn Independent and those anti-Semitic articles.
Yeah, that's a dark chapter for sure.
Right.
Those articles promoted some really harmful conspiracy theories.
And it wasn't just a few articles. This went on for years.
It did, and it really tarnished his reputation. People started boycotting Ford products.
He eventually apologized in 1927, but the damage was done.
It's a reminder that even someone as brilliant and innovative as Ford could still hold prejudiced views.
And those views could have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It's a part of his legacy that we can't ignore. But let's move on to the Great Depression, because here again we see Ford doing things differently.
Right. While other businesses were laying off workers left and right, Ford actually refused to do so.
He even ran his factories at a loss for a time just to keep people employed.
Talk about going against the grain.
It was a bold move, and it showed a certain level of compassion, a sense of responsibility towards his workers.
But it was also a shrewd business decision, right? I mean, he knew that a loyal workforce would be essential for recovery.
And then, of course, World War II breaks out, and Ford once again adapts his industrial might to support the war effort.
The Willow Run plant churning out B-24 Liberator bombers, it's an incredible feat of engineering and logistics.
I mean, they're literally building a bomber an hour at one point.
It shows how adaptable Ford was. He could pivot his production to meet the demands of the time.
But even as the war was raging, he was already looking ahead, thinking about the post-war world.
And that's where we start to see a shift in focus. He
Henry
becomes increasingly interested in preserving the past and celebrating American ingenuity.
That's where Greenfield Village comes in, right?
Yeah.
This living museum dedicated to showcasing American history and craftsmanship.
It's like he's trying to reconnect with a simpler time before mass production and all its complexities.
And his friendship with Thomas Edison deepens during this period as well.
Two giants of innovation, sharing ideas and inspiring each other.
Ford even recreates Edison's Menlo Park laboratory at Greenfield Village, brick by brick.
It's a beautiful tribute to their friendship and to the power of human ingenuity.
But Ford also realized that he couldn't hold on forever. He was getting older and it was time to start thinking about succession.
And that's where his grandson, Henry Ford II, enters the picture.
Right. He gradually hands over the reins of the company, preparing his grandson to lead Ford into the future.
It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were those generational clashes.
But ultimately, Henry Ford II proved to be a capable leader, guiding the company through a period of significant change.
He modernized the company, streamlined operations, introduced new models, and really transformed Ford into the global corporation we know today.
So as we approach the final chapter of Ford's life, we see this fascinating interplay of past, present, and future.
He's reflecting on his accomplishments, grappling with his legacy, and preparing for what's to come.
But before we wrap up our deep dive, let's take a closer look at those final years and what they reveal about the man behind the legend. Last time we were talking about, this transition of power to Henry Ford II. And as Ford gets older, it seems like that interest in Greenfield Village really grows. It's not just a hobby anymore.
Oh yeah, it becomes this passion project, this way for him to kind of reconnect with his roots.
I mean, he's pouring money into it, expanding it, and you're recreating these historical streets and buildings.
And it's not just, a superficial recreation. He's really meticulous about the details. He wants everything to be authentic.
It's like he's trying to capture the essence of a bygone era.
Yeah.
This pre-industrial America that was rapidly disappearing.
And I think there's a sense of nostalgia there, maybe even a bit of regret for the world that he helped to change.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's like he's grappling with the consequences of his own success.
Yeah.
The way that mass production had transformed society.
And his friendship with Edison, I think, plays into that as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're both these giants of the industrial age,
Yeah.
But there's also this shared sense of wonder, this fascination with how things work.
And a belief in the power of human ingenuity, that we can solve any problem if we just put our minds to it.
But even as he's kind of looking back, reminiscing about the past, Ford is also thinking about the future. And that means ensuring the success of the company.
And that's where Henry Ford II comes in. He's being groomed to take over.
Right. And it's not always easy. You've got this clash of personalities, this generational divide.
The old guard versus the new, the tried and true methods versus the newfangled ideas.
But ultimately, Henry Ford II proves himself. He's a shrewd businessman. He's got his own vision for the company.
And he's not afraid to challenge the status quo, just like his grandfather did.
Right. He modernizes the company, streamlines operations, introduces new models.
And really transforms it into the global powerhouse that we know today.
So as Ford's life is drawing to a close, he's seeing his legacy unfold in a way. He's witnessing the success of his grandson, the growth of the company.
And the impact of his own innovations, the way that he changed the world.
It's a remarkable story. And one that's full of contradictions. He was a man of great vision, but also great flaws.
A champion of the worker, but also a staunch opponent of unions.
A believer in progress, but also someone who yearned for a simpler time.
I think his story is ultimately a reminder that even the most influential figures are complex individuals.
They're products of their time, with all the good and the bad that entails.
And it's up to us to try to understand them in their entirety. To acknowledge both their achievements and their failings.
And to learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
So that we can hopefully build a better future.
Exactly. History is not just about celebrating the past. It's about understanding it so that we can move forward in a more informed and compassionate way.
Well said. Well said. I
Right.
think that's a great place to leave it. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have from farm boy to industry titan. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We've learned a lot about Henry Ford, the man, the myth, the legend.
And about the transformative era that he helped to create.
So thank you for joining us on this exploration of Henry Ford's life and legacy.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Until then, take care.